Howdy folks, it's June once again, which here on the Game Reserve means it's time for another console retrospective. And let me tell you, this is the one I have been waiting to do forever because it is finally time to do a console retrospective of my all-time favorite. In the late 80s and early 90s, Nintendo was king of the video game industry. They had revitalized the market in North America after the crash of '83 and would own the market for several years. A challenger to their dominance would emerge in the form of Sega, which led to the first true console war, but despite some advantages on the part of Sega, Nintendo's superior business sense would keep them on top in the end. Their business sense wasn't perfect though, as they would unfortunately create their biggest enemy when they broke off a deal with Sony to create a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. Something that angered Sony so much that they would enter the industry alone with the PlayStation out of spite. To say that Nintendo was unprepared for Sony's dominance would be an understatement. Though Nintendo would be bringing the superior hardware to market, the main thing that screwed over the N64 was the choice to go with cartridges as opposed to CDs. Nintendo thought it would be an advantage. Quality CD drives were still expensive and would jack up the cost of the console significantly unless you went with a cheaper drive, which would have resulted in slower load times. And that turned out to be the case, as the N64 would launch $100 cheaper than the PS1 and would have lightning fast load times in addition to superior graphics. However, that just wasn't enough. Though sticking with cartridges had its advantages, the trade-off was production cost. It cost upwards of $30 per cartridge to make a game for the N64, whereas it only took a couple of bucks to put one out on the PS1. The cartridge format was also limiting due to how small storage capacity was, so while the N64 had better graphics, it could make bigger games on the PS1. Needless to say, most third-party developers opted to go with PS1 and only put out a game on the N64 if the PS1 version proved to be a mega hit. This was the main reason the PlayStation 1 ended up winning the 32-bit era in the end, but that's not to say that the N64 was a failure, far from it. The N64 still had strengths over the PlayStation. The library was arguably better than the PS1, with tons of groundbreaking games being released for the console, many of which wouldn't have been possible on the PS1. The N64 was also the go-to place for multiplayer gaming back in the day. If you were having a multiplayer night in the late 90s, odds are you were playing on the N64. Let's also not forget that it was reliable to boot and it snapped to program for, which is why it easily outsold the Sega Saturn. To this day, the N64 is still regarded as one of the best consoles ever created, despite the fact that it lost to the PlayStation by a pretty wide margin. The N64 also holds great significance to me personally, because this is where my love of video games started. I must have been 5 or 6 years old when my Aunt Sharon gifted me and my brothers an N64, and since then I have had a great love of all things video games. I still have the old N64 from my boyhood, and I still have a pretty good chunk of the games. However, for this retrospective, I will be looking at these games via all-in-one card I bought courtesy of Software Seconds. So without further ado, I humbly present my N64 retrospective.